The latch held. That was the first thing he noticed before the cold, before the wind, before the sound of the creek breaking somewhere out beyond the paddock, like a rifle shot through greenwood. The latch held, and the door did not shift on its hinges, and the small oil lamp on the shelf beside the stove did not so much as flicker when the gust struck the north wall. A man learns, after enough winters, to listen to a building the way he listens to a horse, for the small sounds it makes when it is unafraid. His cabin was not afraid. The wind outside had teeth in it that would strip a jackrabbit down to bone before morning, and inside, on the low bench beside the stove, the dog slept with its paws twitching in whatever dream a dog has when the world is trying to kill everything that breathes and cannot. The latch held. He set his hand on the door frame and felt no give in it. He had built the frame himself 6 weeks earlier, out of green cottonwood he had soaked in creek water for 11 days, and then dried in the smoke of a slow fire, and every man in Sweetgrass County had told him, in one way or another, that he was a fool. 6 weeks earlier, Ephraim Coyle had stood at the edge of the frozen creek with nothing but a shovel, an old dog, and an idea that every man in the county called a fool's errand. The creek at that time had been only half frozen, running black beneath a lace of ice that thickened by the hour, and the dog had refused to leave the water's edge for 3 days running. Ephraim had followed the dog down there each morning before first light, and stood watching it dig at a patch of hardening mud where the bank curved back on itself in a small crescent shielded by a lean of old willow. The dog was a shepherd of no particular breeding, gone gray around the muzzle, half lame in the left hip from a kick it had taken from a mule 6 summers back. Its name was Boone. Boone did not dig without reason. Ephraim had known the dog 11 years, and could count on one hand the times it had wasted its own effort. The settlement of Corvin's Ford lay a mile and a half to the west, 27 houses and a chapel, and a general store that also served as the land office when the agent bothered to ride out from Cheyenne. The people there were not cruel. They were, in the way of most frontier towns in that year, tired. They had come out in wagons from Missouri and Illinois, expecting a country that would give them back what they gave it, and the country had given back less than they had hoped and more than they had bargained for. Ephraim Coyle had come out with them in the summer of 1878, and had built his cabin a mile east of the settlement on a low rise above the creek, where the ground was harder and the wind stronger, and no one else wanted to bother. He was a man of 42 years, unmarried, with hands that had done every kind of work a frontier hand can do, and he was known in the settlement chiefly for not being known. He kept to himself. He read a book when he could get one. He owed no man money and asked no man's opinion. On the 4th day of the dog's digging, Ephraim brought his shovel down to the creek and began to dig with the animal. He did not know, then, what he was digging for. The dog knew, in whatever way a dog knows a thing. Ephraim knew only that the winter coming on had a shape to it he had not seen before in 7 Wyoming winters. The geese had gone through 3 weeks early. The muskrats had built their lodges higher than he had ever seen. The cottonwood bark on the north side of the older trees was already splitting from a cold that had not yet fully arrived. He had read once, in a battered almanac, he had traded a pound of coffee for off a dying trapper the year before, that when the beasts of a country all began to prepare at once, a man ought to stop what he was doing and prepare with them. The trapper's almanac had been a strange book. Half of it was weather notes. The other half was drawings of shelter cross-sections in a hand so shaky the ink had blurred, and margin notes in a language Ephraim thought was probably Shoshone rendered in a rough French. He had puzzled over those drawings for 2 winters without understanding them. He was beginning to understand. He dug with the dog for an hour that morning before his shovel struck something that was not mud and was not stone. It was iron. The sound of it, the dull, deep clank of forged metal buried under 3 feet of hardening bank clay, carried up through the shaft of the shovel into the bones of his wrist and stopped him where he stood. Boone sat back on its haunches and looked at him with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite relief. Ephraim knelt down in the mud and worked with his hands. What he pulled from the bank of that creek, over the course of the next 2 days, was the frame of a stove. Not a modern parlor stove. A trapper's iron box stove of a make he did not recognize, heavy as a small anvil. Its plate still sound, its hinges rusted but whole. Beneath the stove, wrapped in oilcloth and buried deeper still, was a coil of copper pipe of the kind used for stills, and a second smaller iron plate, and a handful of forged brackets whose purpose he did not at first understand. He carried the pieces up to his cabin on the back of his 1 mule across 3 trips, and by nightfall of the 2nd day the pieces lay in a heap on the packed earth outside his door, and Boone lay curled beside the heap as if guarding it, and Ephraim Coyle sat on the step of his own cabin looking at that pile of iron and thinking about what it meant that a dog had dug up a stove. Word travels in a small settlement the way smoke travels in still air. By the end of that week, the story of Ephraim's dig was known from Corvin's ford to the county line, and the story had grown in the telling. Some said he had found gold. Some said he had found a body. Some said Ephraim had gone strange, following his dog around like a man who had run out of his own ideas, and that no good would come of it. Reverend Amos Turnbull, who kept the chapel and buried the dead, and did his best to hold the settlement together with what patience a man could summon in that country, rode out to Ephraim's place on a Tuesday in the last week of October. He came with a small tin of coffee as a gift and the intention, plain in his face before he even dismounted, of speaking to Ephraim about the danger of superstition. The Reverend was a good man. Ephraim knew that. He offered him a seat by the fire and let him say what he had come to say. The Reverend said that a man in a hard country needed the fellowship of other men, and that a man who took his direction from an animal had turned away from the order God had set in the world, and that whatever Ephraim had dug from a creek, and here the Reverend's eyes went briefly to the pile of iron still stacked outside the door under a canvas, was not worth the strangeness that had come with it. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply dismissed the whole thing. In the way that a doctor dismisses a symptom, he does not have the tools to understand, and when he had said his piece, he drank his coffee and rode home. Ephraim watched him go without speaking. Boone watched him go with its head on its paws. The pier came 2 days later. His name was Wesley Hobbs. He was a man of Ephraim's own age, homesteading 160 acres of flat pasture on the south side of the settlement, married to a woman named Ruth, who had once brought Ephraim a jar of preserved plums for reasons he had never fully worked out. Wesley and Ephraim had helped each other with roofing and calving and hay for 6 summers, and if Ephraim had a friend in the county, Wesley Hobbs was as close as the word would stretch. Wesley did not come with coffee. He came with a bottle of rough whiskey and a smile that had something sad in it before he even opened his mouth. He looked at the pile of iron. He looked at the shovel leaning against the door. He looked at Boone, who did not rise to greet him, and he shook his head slow, and he said, quiet enough that a man who did not know him would not have caught the cruelty in it, Ephraim, you're going to freeze out here alone with a dog and a rusted stove, and the worst part is you're going to think, right up to the last, that you had a plan. He said it not to wound. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes is a kindness, a warning against a course he thought was already too far gone. Ephraim heard the pity in it more clearly than he would have heard anger, and pity, on the frontier, was the harder thing to bear. He nodded once. He took the bottle. He said nothing. Wesley drank a cup of the whiskey himself, and left before the sun was down. Boone watched him go too. That night Ephraim opened the almanac by lamplight and read the shaky drawings for the 4th time that season, and this time, with the pile of iron sitting outside his door and the dog asleep at his feet, the drawings began to speak to him. The drawings showed a shelter cut into the side of a slope, 3 walls of earth and 1 wall of timber, a stove set not against the wood wall, but centered in the room, its pipe passing not straight up through the roof, but sideways through a channel of stone and clay that ran the full length of the north wall before turning at last to vent. The margin notes in the trapper's blurred French referred to something the trapper had called l'humour qui respire, the wall that breathes. Ephraim did not speak French. He had spent a winter in a mining camp in Colorado 10 years back with a man from Quebec who had taught him enough phrases to be dangerous, and he worked out the meaning slowly, letter by letter, until he had it. A wall that held heat the way a stone in a fire held heat. A wall that gave that heat back through the long, cold hours of a night when the stove had gone to embers. A thermal wall. A wall built not to keep the cold out, for no wall does that, but to keep the warmth in long after the fire had done its work. He began the next morning before first light. The first thing he did was knot the wall. The first thing he did was a knot. He needed to lash the copper pipe to the iron brackets in a way that would not shift when the metal expanded with heat, and every knot he knew was too rigid or too loose or too likely to char through. He sat for 2 hours by the lamp turning a length of wet rawhide over in his hands, testing, undoing, testing again, until he had worked out a variant of a running hitch that snugged tighter when the pipe warmed and loosened just enough when it cooled to keep from splitting the sheath. It was a knot no man had taught him. It was a knot that would matter in a way he did not yet know, on a night 5 weeks in the future when a lame horse and a sick child arrived at his door together. He tied a dozen of them and set them aside. He cut the angle for the pipe next. The trapper's drawings called for an angle of what Ephraim reckoned to be about 11 degrees off horizontal, steep enough for smoke to draw, shallow enough for the flue to hold heat in the stone. He tested the angle 3 ways with a plumb bob and a straight length of hickory before he trusted it. He notched the timber to hold the pipe at that angle. He was working, he understood now, with a physics he did not have the words for, a physics that had been known to trappers and Shoshone winter camp builders and old country stonemasons, and no one at all in the settlement of Corvin's Ford. The material was the third thing. He needed something to pack behind the stones of the breathing wall, something that would hold heat without burning, that would not settle over time, that would not draw moisture. He tried sand first. Sand held heat but shifted. He tried clay. Clay held heat but cracked. In the end, on the 6th day of the build, he remembered a line from the almanac about Sendra's et pail. Ash and chaff, packed together in equal measure, and he spent 2 days sifting fireplace ash from the settlement's blacksmith shop. The smith let him take it for the asking, saying only that a man who wanted ash in October was a man he did not need understand, and threshing the last of his oat chaff into a barrel. He mixed the two by hand until they held together like a dry mortar, and packed the mixture behind the stones of the north wall, in careful lifts, tamping each lift with the butt of an axe handle. The wall itself was the last. The wall was 3 feet thick at its base and 2 feet thick at its top, and ran the full length of the north side of the cabin, built up against the existing timber wall, so that the timber served as the inside face, and the new stone and ash mass served as the outside. Between them ran the copper pipe from the stove, coiling once, twice, 3 times through the mass before it turned and rose, and vented at last through a small clay chimney at the northeast corner. The stove itself sat centered in the room, 5 feet in from a wall, on a bed of flat stones. When Ephraim finally fired it on the last day of November, the smoke drew clean, and the wall did not crack, and by nightfall the whole north side of the cabin was warm to the touch, and stayed warm for 6 hours after he let the fire die. He heard it again, a low groan from somewhere beneath the floor. He didn't know yet whether it was the structure settling or something giving way. He lay in his bunk that first night with Boone at his feet and listened to the sound. It came from the earth beneath the puncheon boards, from the base of the north wall, from the very seam where new stone met old timber. It was not the sound of a wall failing. He had heard walls fail in mining camps and in cattle sheds, and in the first cabin he had built as a young man and lost in a spring flood. Walls failing had a sharpness to them, a splintering. This was different. This was the sound of something adjusting to a load it had not carried before. He listened to it a long time. He did not sleep until near dawn. When he did sleep, Boone did not sleep. The dog sat at the door of the cabin with its ears up and its head tilted toward the north, and it stayed that way until first light. The mockery, when it came the second time, came in a different form. Wesley Hobbs rode out on the 2nd of December to see what Ephraim had done, and when he saw the wall and the stove and the strange coil of copper pipe running through the stones, he did not smile. He did not laugh. He looked at the wall for a long time, and then he looked at Ephraim, and he said, "You've built yourself a monument, Ephraim. A monument to a book by a dead man. I hope it keeps you warm." He said it slower than the first time. There was still pity in it, but there was something else underneath the pity now, a small, cold recognition that he did not have anything like this in his own house, and that if the winter came the way Ephraim thought it was coming, he might have wished he did. He rode home without drinking any whiskey that day. Ephraim watched him go. Boone watched him go, and this time the dog stood up on its stiff hip and walked to the edge of the porch and stayed there until the horse and rider were out of sight. The Reverend did not come again. He had said what he came to say. Word of Ephraim's wall spread in the settlement the way word of the dig had spread, but the tone of it was different now. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. A few, Ephraim heard this only later from a boy who came to trade for eggs, a few looked at the sky and at their own thin walls and said nothing at all. The storm came on the 14th of December. It came at night without much warning, and by the second morning the drifts stood 8 feet against the north side of every cabin in the county, and the wind was blowing at a temperature no thermometer in Corvin's Ford was calibrated to measure. Ephraim woke to the sound of the wind and knew, in the way that a man knows a familiar road even in the dark, that the winter he had prepared for was the winter that had come. He heard it again, a low groan from somewhere beneath the floor. He didn't know yet whether it was the structure settling or something giving way. He rose and stoked the stove and set water on for coffee and stood a long moment at the small window on the east side of the cabin, watching the snow come down at an angle that was less like falling than like being driven. Boone was awake at his feet. Boone had been awake since before he had. At noon on that first day of the storm, when the wind had settled into a steady scream, and the temperature in the yard had gone past what any man in the settlement had ever tried to measure, Ephraim heard a sound outside the door that he did not recognize. It was not the wind. It was not the timbers. It was the sound of a hand, a small hand, half frozen, half strengthed, knocking on the door in a pattern that was not the pattern of an adult. He opened the door. The child was 7 years old. Her name was Sari Hobbs. She was Wesley Hobbs's youngest, and she was wearing a coat too thin for the weather and a scarf that had frozen solid across her mouth, and she had walked, or been half-carried by a horse whose reins she was still holding in a fist that had gone the color of wet paper, the 1.5 miles from her father's homestead to Ephraim's door. The horse behind her was a bay gelding that Ephraim knew, Wesley's second horse, the one he used for the plow, and the horse was standing on 3 legs. Its right foreleg was held up out of the snow at an angle no living horse's leg should hold, and the animal was shaking in a way that was not from the cold alone. Ephraim brought them both inside. He brought the horse into the small lean-to on the south side of the cabin that he had built for his mule, and he brought the child into the main room, and he set her on the bench closest to the stove and began to work on her hands. Her fingers were white to the second knuckle. Her cheeks were white in patches the size of a thumbprint. Her breathing had a rattle in it that he did not like. She was not crying. She had gone past crying. She was looking at him with eyes that did not, at first, quite see him. He worked on her hands for an hour before he could get her fingers to move. He worked on her cheeks with warm cloth for another hour before the color came back into them in an uneven, painful bloom. He held a tin cup of broth to her mouth and got her to swallow a little. He wrapped her in a wool blanket and set her closer to the breathing wall, and he watched her in the low lamplight as her body began, slowly, then more surely, to remember how to be warm. While he worked on the child, the horse in the lean-to was dying. He knew it without going out to see it. He had felt the leg when he had brought the animal in. It was not a break he could set. It was a bone driven up through the meat of the shoulder from the animal's fall in a drift somewhere between here and the Hobbs place, and the horse had walked the last quarter-mile on it because a 7-year-old child had held its reins and asked it to. The horse would not last the night. He knew that. He could not think about it yet. Sari spoke for the first time when the light had gone to full dark and the stove was throwing its heat back off the breathing wall in slow, steady waves that filled the small room with a warmth Ephraim himself had never quite felt in a cabin before. She said, "Papa said to come to you." She said it without inflection, the way a child repeats a thing she has been told to remember. She said, "Papa said the wall would hold." Ephraim did not answer her. He did not know, yet, what to say to that. He set another cup of broth in her hands, and he watched her drink it, and he went to the door of the cabin and stood there for a long moment listening to the storm. He heard it again, a low groan from somewhere beneath the floor. He didn't know yet whether it was the structure settling or something giving way. But this time he knew, in the part of a man that knows a thing before his mind admits it, that the sound was neither. The sound was the ashen chaff pack behind the north wall, warming through, expanding by fractions of an inch against the stones, giving back the heat of the stove into the room in a rhythm that had begun, over the course of the day, to match the rhythm of his own breath. The wall was breathing. Lou Moore could respire. It had never made that sound before because the stove had never been fired that hard for that long. It would make that sound, he understood now, every winter night for the rest of his life, so long as he kept the stove alive. The horse died sometime in the 3rd hour after full dark. He heard the last of it through the wall to the lean-to, the soft, final noise a large animal makes when it lets go of the weight of standing. He did not go out. He could not have helped it. He sat instead at the bench beside the sleeping child and put his hand on Boone's head and waited for the sound to stop, and when it stopped, he closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and went back to work. The second day of the storm was worse than the first. The wind did not let up. The temperature did not lift. Sari slept most of the day, waking only to eat and drink and let Ephraim check her fingers and toes for the black. That would mean he had not been fast enough. The black did not come. Her breathing eased by afternoon. By evening she was sitting up and asking, in a small voice, after her father. Ephraim did not know what to tell her. He could not go out. No man could go out in that weather and expect to come back. He told her that her father was strong and had a house and had thought ahead, and that when the storm broke, they would go together and see. She accepted this the way a child accepts a thing she has decided to believe. On the second night, the groan from the wall was steady. Ephraim did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch. He stoked the stove. He listened. He watched the child. Boone lay across the doorway with its head on its paws and did not move. The storm broke on the fourth morning. It broke not with any drama, but with the slow easing of a thing that had exhausted itself. Ephraim woke to a silence he had not heard in 3 days, and he lay a long moment in his bunk listening to it, and then he rose and stoked the stove, and looked out the small east window at a country that had gone entirely white to the horizon. Sari was awake. She was watching him. She said, "Can we go home?" And Ephraim, who had been thinking about that question through the whole night, said, "We'll go together. First we'll eat." He fed her. He fed himself. He put on every piece of wool and hide he owned, and he wrapped the child in 3 blankets, and he set her on his back in a sling he made from a length of canvas, and he took his shovel and his snowshoes and Boone, and he set out for the Hobbs place. The 1.5 miles took him 4 hours. The drifts stood higher than his head in 3 places, and he dug through them where he had to and went around them where he could, and Boone went ahead of him at each drift, sniffing at the snow, choosing the line, always choosing the line that turned out to be the right one. Sari did not speak. She held on. She was, Ephraim understood, a Hobbs. She had her father's stubbornness in her at 7 years old, and she would not let go until she was told. They came in sight of the Hobbs place at a little past noon on that 4th day, and Ephraim stopped 100 yards out and stood in the snow a long moment before he went on. The Hobbs house was still standing. That was the first thing. But the roof on the north side had caved in, a soft, deep collapse where the snow had built up and the ridgepole had given, and there was no smoke coming from a chimney. Ephraim's chest went tight. He hitched Sari higher on his back, and he went the last 100 yards at a pace that was as close to a run as a man can come in 4 feet of snow. The door of the Hobbs house did not open when he pushed it. He put his shoulder to it. It gave on the 3rd try. Inside, in the ruined half of the house where the roof had come down, was snow to the height of a man's waist. In the other half, huddled in the corner of the small east room, where the collapse had not reached, were Wesley Hobbs and his wife Ruth. They were alive. They were both alive. They were wrapped in every blanket in the house, and Wesley had built a small fire in the fireplace with what was left of a broken chair, and they had been sitting there for 2 days waiting to see if the rest of the roof would hold. When Ephraim came through the door with Sari on his back, Ruth Hobbs made a sound that Ephraim would remember for the rest of his life. She made the sound a woman makes when a child she has already begun to grieve for is given back to her. Wesley did not make a sound. Wesley stood up from the floor where he had been sitting, and he crossed the ruined room to Ephraim, and he took his daughter down from Ephraim's back, and he held her against his chest for a long time without speaking. Ephraim did not stay in the Hobbs house. He looked at the roof. He looked at the walls. He looked at the small fire and the wet blankets and the cold that was already coming back into the room now that the wind had died and the sun on the snow was making the whole country brighter than it was warm. He looked at Wesley Hobbs, and Wesley Hobbs looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Ephraim said, "Come to my place." That was 3 words. Along with the words he had spoken to Sari the night before and the small commands he had given to Boone through the walk, they made almost the whole of his speech during that week of the storm. He had never been a man who wasted words. He was less of one now. Wesley Hobbs nodded. Ruth Hobbs was already gathering what she could carry. Ephraim brought them back the way he had come. It took 6 hours. Boone led the way again. Sari rode on her father's back this time. Ruth walked with her arm through Ephraim's, not from tenderness, but from the plain need for the strength of a second body against the snow, and Ephraim did not mind it. The sun was going down when they came in sight of the cabin, and the smoke from Ephraim's chimney was rising straight and steady into the still air, and the small east window showed the yellow of the lamp inside, and Boone gave a sound at the sight of it that was not quite a bark and not quite a whimper, and that Ephraim had not heard from the dog in 11 years. The Reverend came the next day. He came on snowshoes from the settlement, and he was not alone. Behind him came 4 other men, the Reverend, the schoolteacher, the blacksmith, and a man named Coates whose farm lay to the north, and each of them was leading someone. A wife, a child, a grown son. The chapel had lost its roof on the 3rd night of the storm. 2 houses in the settlement had lost roofs. 3 had lost livestock. 1 old man had lost more than that, and the Reverend's eyes when he said it told Ephraim who it was before the Reverend spoke the name. Ephraim opened the door. He stood aside. They came in. His cabin was not large. It was not built for 15 people. But the breathing wall gave off its steady, low heat, and the stove threw its warmth out into the room in even waves, and the ashen chaff packed behind the stones held enough of the day's fire to keep the whole room at a temperature that a man from Missouri or Illinois would call summer at that latitude in that month. They came in. They sat where they could. Ruth Hobbs set to work at the stove without asking. Ephraim brought out the last of his salt pork and half a sack of cornmeal and a jar of dried beans he had kept back from a fall, and Ruth cooked, and the children ate, and no one for a long time spoke. The Reverend sat by the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the wall, on the strange thick, uneven wall of stone and ash and packed clay that was the north side of the cabin. He looked at it a long time. He did not say what he was thinking. Ephraim did not ask. Wesley Hobbs stood by the stove with his hand on his daughter's head. He looked at Ephraim once across the room, and he did not smile, and Ephraim did not smile back, but there was a thing passed between them in that look that did not need a smile, a thing that would not need words, ever, between them again. Boone lay in the middle of the room and slept. The dog had done its work. It had dug at a patch of hardening bank clay for 11 days when no one had asked it to, and had led a man to a stove buried by some trapper dead 30 years or more, and had walked ahead through the drifts and chosen a line, and now it slept. Ephraim watched the dog for a long moment before he turned back to the work of feeding people who had, 6 weeks earlier, looked at him with pity in their faces. He did not think about that pity now. He did not need to. The room was warm. The wall was breathing. The fire was steady. The food was hot. A child slept in the corner on a folded blanket. Another child ate cornmeal from a tin plate with hands that had almost lost their fingers 3 days before. A woman stirred a pot. A man stood with his hand on his daughter's head. A dog slept. Outside the window, the snow was blue in the failing light. Inside, the fire made the sound a good fire makes when does not have to work hard, and the wall behind the fire made its low, steady groan, and the latch on the door held. The strongest walls are rarely the ones built to impress. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting by the fire.